Hello, my name is Jim Romans, and welcome to our talk today on the dark side of leadership. Here are some things we'll talk about today. We'll look at a few of the most hated dictators and despots in history and see what they may have in common. We'll consider some of the key characteristics that make up good ethical leaders, and on the flip side, what are some of the traits or characteristics that contribute to really terrible leaders, the dark side of leadership. We'll also introduce and discuss a term known as the toxic triangle, which includes three main ingredients that, once they're all together, contributes to forming a toxic environment. And then we'll look further at the toxic triangle by applying a well-known case study from history to that to see how that applies to the toxic triangle. We'll also consider some things we can do, some actions we could take to prevent a toxic culture or toxic environment from forming, as well as some corrective actions we could take if one already exists. And I'm hoping we can have a little surprise at the end. So let's see, you may recognize some of these despots from history. All of them are considered mass murderers, tortured many people, and have contributed to corrupt governments. The first one is Idi Amin from Uganda from the 70s. You probably recognize Fidel Castro, Cuba. Adolf Hitler, certainly everyone knows him from the German Nazi Party in the 30s and 40s, World War II. Benito Mussolini was the fascist leader of Italy during that time frame as well, World War II. Pol Pot was the leader of Cambodia in the 70s. And lastly, Joseph Stalin was the leader of Russia during the 1930s. And also World War II as well. Now, there are plenty of other evil dictators as well that aren't here, but if we just consider this group, what do they all have in common? Well, we'll see that they really exhibited toxic leadership in their respective countries and their respective time periods. But taking a more positive view, we think about ethical leadership. We consider that leadership itself is someone having influence over others, followers, to reach some common goal, to help edify the followers, to help build them up. So there's a moral aspect to leadership in most cases. So given that moral, ethical part of good leadership, here are some of those characteristics. Ethical leaders are respectful of others. They engage in active listening. Really focused on what people are saying as opposed to thinking about what they're going to say next, and also to welcome different perspectives from people. Service, very similar to servant leadership style, really concerns itself with the well-being of others, the followers. So leaders are really focused on others. Justice is being fair-minded to all, whether you like people or not. You're being fair-minded or just to them. Honesty certainly is just not telling lies. And building community is where the leaders go beyond just working with his or her specific followers and help make society at large better. Those are the good characteristics of good leadership. Here are several characteristics of really bad leadership. And even though I focused earlier on political despots, we see dark side of leadership in many other areas or domains, such as nursing administration, ladies gymnastics, where many women were sexually assaulted and abused, and also even in the corporate environment recently from Enron. So some of these characteristics include being very self-centered, lacking integrity, not telling the truth, not being honest. Also, these leaders have an ambition to grow their domain, their territory. They're never satisfied or satiated with gobbling up nations and people. They also are arrogant bullies, basically, and they don't care about their actions nor the consequences of their actions. They are incapable of managing people with quality, and they have dark traits or behaviors or habits that they customarily do. They put people down, including the people who report to them. They are very self-centered, self-focused, narcissistic. They just lack a good ethical backbone. They just lack ethics. And of course, they because they're so self-centered, that they are always self-promoting themselves. So now we'll look at the toxic triangle. So as I mentioned earlier, these are three main areas or categories. I say that they're all the necessary ingredients to build this perfect storm, this perfect environment. The first one includes destructive leaders. So destructive leaders often are characterized by charm or charisma that they have over their followers. They may or may not be attractive, but the main point is there's something special about them, those leaders, that attract people to follow them. They also have a sense of personalized power, a lot of authority or force that they have, mainly for their own benefit. As I mentioned earlier, they are narcissistic or self-absorbed, focusing on themselves, their career, insatiable appetite to dominate and control and acquire. They often have negative life themes, many from really bad traumatic childhood situations, and they have this overall ideology of hate. It's part of their twisted worldview. So, second area, aside from destructive leaders, all leaders need followers. So these are called susceptible followers and are divided into two groups of susceptible followers, the conformers and colluders. So conformers are like follow the leader, as we see the Pied Piper illustration here. Conformers basically follow their leaders. They have unmet needs. They could be combating loneliness, or they're trying to fill a void in their lives. So they're latched onto this charismatic leader, and they basically follow their leader. They often have low self-esteem, and they feel more important when they're attached to this charismatic leader. And due to their immaturity and their strong attachment to that leader, they'll basically do whatever the leader commands, even if it's unethical or illegal. Now, the second part of susceptible followers would be the colluders or the lackeys, those who work for and support the destructive leaders. Their characteristics are similar to the destructive leader: a high degree of ambition or greed. They may be looking for higher status. They also have that similar warped worldview that the destructive leader has, and they have really poor or bad values such as selfishness as well. Now, to complete all of the ingredients that make this perfect storm, we'll see that a conducive environment is necessary for the destructive leaders and the two types of susceptible followers. First thing we see here is a lot of instability in the environment. So there could be issues due to war. It could be issues with a really terrible economy or a lot of political unrest. All of these things can make the overall environment very unstable. There could be a perceived threat, and focus on the word perceived because it doesn't necessarily need to be a real threat, but a perceived threat that the destructive leader forces them on people through propaganda. The susceptible followers latch onto that, and that overall builds this conducive environment for this toxic culture. There's similar cultural values that the susceptible followers have with the destructive leaders. Often the followers are on the same culture as the leaders. So whatever those values may be that the leaders espouse, followers often have similar type of values, all within this conducive environment. And then lastly, a lack of checks and balances or governance to ensure that what's going on is the right ethical thing to do. So all three of those ingredients of destructive leaders, susceptible followers, and conducive environments all come together to create this toxic triangle, or building a toxic and supporting a toxic environment. So I mentioned looking at a case study and apply the toxic triangle to that case study. Everyone is very familiar with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi parties. So let's look at each of these components and Hitler and the Nazis during World War II. So although you may say that Hitler may not be physically attractive, there was something special about him that inspired people to follow him at that time in history within Germany. He also used his political power for his personal gain, certainly. He was self-obsessed and narcissistic with this sense of grandiosity. Just watch some of the old clips of his speeches, how passionate he is. And a lot of that passion really, I think, reflects his self-obsession. In terms of negative life themes, his father was abusive to him, and as a young man, he was a failed art student. So he had some negative things going on early in his childhood and partially could be traumatic, which could help set the stage for destructive leadership. And lastly, Hitler and the Nazis embodied a focus on the master race or the Aryan race as a supreme race. And all other races, specifically Jews, but not exclusively the Jews, just did not meet the requirements of that master race. Therefore, there was this whole ideology that was built around hating people who were not part of that master race. In terms of susceptible followers from the conformers, after World War I and during World War II, Germans had a real need for community. We'll talk a little bit more shortly about the Treaty of Versailles and the condition that Germany was in World War II, after World War I. So there were a lot of unmet needs that the German people had back then, one of them being a strong need for community. Also, the German people needed to feel important again. They needed to feel whole. They had low self-evaluations of themselves. And quite frankly, with low maturity, they really could latch on to a very charismatic leader and then engage in vengeful behavior against others. Now, the people who you could say worked for Hitler, the colluders, the Nazi leadership, certainly they were ambitious in their own right, looking for their own careers. They had a similar worldview as Hitler in terms of a focus on the master Aryan, superior German race. And they also had bad values too, like greed, ambition, selfishness. And then the third component of the toxic triangle is the conducive environment. So one way of looking at the result of World War I, after World War I ended, the Treaty of Versailles really put a huge burden on Germany as it left World War I and prior to World War II. And that whole way that Germany was punished from World War I could be represented in the acronym BRAT, B-R-A-T, focused on blame. Germany was blamed for World War I. Also, the R was reparations. The Germans had to pay all the damages from the First World War. That hurt their economy, certainly. The A in BRAT is armed forces. They were disarmed. They lost their military might. And with all of that, the T part is territory. They lost much territory. And with that, in addition to the large reparations that they paid, it really hurt their economy, especially during the time of around the Great Depression. So all of these factors contributed to an unstable environment overall in Germany. Again, there was the perceived threat of Jews or any non-Germans. Cultural values, Hitler very much focused on strong patriotism, hyper-nationalism as well, and that's what the German people at the time, coming out of the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, really latched onto. They were looking for a way to restore things back to the old great Germany from the past. And again, there's no governance, checks or balances. The economic, financial institutions, the banks, all were in rooms. So all of these three main components came together at a certain time in history within Germany to really bring this toxic triangle together to form a toxic culture. Well, on the positive side, what are some things that people can do? Mainly leaders, but I don't want to say exclusively leaders because followers too can help with ideas and support of their leaders in some things that they can do to either prevent a toxic environment from forming or help correct a bad environment, toxic environment to become good. One is to support ethical standards, take a tough stance on any deviations from those standards, and have a clear policy statement, train people on what those ethical standards are. Where I've worked in several places, we have annual online training we need to take for things like sexual harassment or cybersecurity or compliance issues. anti-corruption, things like that. So this could be part of the yearly training for new people who come in, as well as more seasoned employees as well. Be very clear on what type of behavior is both acceptable and those types of behaviors that are unacceptable, and of course that could be part of the training. Create a culture of transparency so people are not afraid to speak up. The term is whistleblowers. And I know in one company where I worked, especially regarding ethics, we were all encouraged to, if we see something, we say something, and not worry about being intimidated or feeling some negative repercussions. So I think through this too, we could also create a culture of transparency around toxic environments and help to bring that to people's awareness and stop those types of things from happening or continuing to happen. Build safe support structures and processes that would be well publicized. People would be trained on them. Again, they would help people feel comfortable about reporting some instances of toxic abuse or environments. Raise awareness through coaching, again, and training. Having leaders become self-reflective, which we've spoken before, is something really good for leaders to do, to go back and reflect on their behaviors, the actions that they've taken, to do that periodically, to see maybe they have an unconscious bias or a blind spot where they're contributing to a toxic culture. So having people help them with that through coaching and training, and also self-reflection on their own part, can help with that. Well, if we hire the right leaders, then we shouldn't have toxic environments, right? Well, we can have a human resources department help train leaders for good recruiting and interviewing, best practices for candidates to look for any potential issues where we may be bringing someone into the company who maybe has been in a toxic environment or even started a really bad toxic environment. So try to screen people out and get an understanding if we think they could be contributing to a toxic environment. And again, like I said, all people involved, not just leaders, but followers can contribute to this. And that's also emotional intelligence can be used by leaders and followers. And it's almost like a wrapper around all of this. So emotional intelligence, in a nutshell, really is about understanding and controlling our emotions in our relationships with other people so we can be more successful. So destructive leaders do not have a very strong emotional intelligence or very high emotional intelligence. But leaders and followers can really use emotional intelligence for many, if not all, of these items here to help understand toxic environments that are forming, feel comfortable about speaking out in an emotionally intelligent way, help with training and coaching, helping leaders to change and self-reflect, and also basically using emotional intelligence to recruit those leaders to try to guarantee that we're bringing people in to the organization who would not be fostering toxic culture. So the main point here is how to incorporate emotional intelligence in our hiring practices, in our training, in our coaching, and also in building and sustaining a good organizational culture. I promised something at the end. Hopefully you'll find this a little educational and a little fun. So if you remember the necessary conditions that we just spoke about of forming a toxic triangle, well, we first of all need destructive leaders in that mix. We also need an environment that's conducive to toxic leadership. And then we need a group of susceptible followers. And all three of those together will create a toxic triangle. And then when we do have toxic triangle or toxic situations, to help stop the toxic culture or even prevent it if we don't have one, we can do things like hiring the right leaders, certainly hiring the right people, using, as I mentioned, emotional intelligence to help us with training and coaching and recruitment to help with our culture and to try to support a non-toxic culture. We can also create and support overall a culture of transparency and clearly define what behavior is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and also develop some standards to prevent and deal with any toxic cultures that do happen. So I think given all of this, we can see that the toxic triangle itself is evil, but following these points that we just outlined really heals the environment. With that, I thank you for your time.